As part of this unit on planning a family, now that we've talked about the reproductive systems and how they function, it's important to talk about exactly what happens during the menstrual cycle and how that impacts pregnancy, as well as what happens if conception does occur during the menstrual cycle. So first, let's look at the menstrual cycle, and you'll notice here that this is labeled a typical 28-day cycle. We say typical because menstruation and the length of time that the menstrual cycle lasts for can be different from one body to another. It might be a 30-day cycle or longer, or it might be somewhat shorter than this. For other people, there isn't a predictable cycle, and from one month to another, the time frame is a little erratic. This is especially true for young adults. It's very common for your cycle to not be predictable and regular. When we say typical, what that means is average. You see here where day one is indicated. We determine day one when menstruation begins. What's happening is that the lining of the uterus is being shed and it's passing through the cervix and out of the vagina, out of the body. Whenever that starts to happen, that day is counted as day one, and you would begin counting from there. There's a misconception that what happens during menstruation is bleeding. It's often what's referred to, although when we bleed, it's because we have a wound or an injury that's exposing an open blood vessel, vein, or artery and allowing blood to leave our body, and that will continue until it's stopped by some kind of outside force, pressure, or stitches, bandage, whatever it might be, or the clotting factors in our own blood help to clot that wound and prevent the blood from continuing to flow out of our bodies. It's very different from what is happening during menstruation because there's no wound, there's no injury, blood is not flowing freely. It's simply that lining of the uterus leaving the body. There's a finite amount of it. It can't happen indefinitely. There's no concern of the flow of blood not ending because you're not bleeding in that way. Typically, menstruation lasts anywhere from 3 to 7 days. It can be different from person to person or different from one month to another. Somewhere around day 7, depending on how long menstruation lasts, your endometrial lining has now been completely shed from the uterus. What's going to happen next is that the uterus is going to prepare itself for the following month. Starting now, that lining, that endometrium, begins to regrow, to thicken and replace itself. It's a blood-rich tissue that lines the uterus. It serves as a nurturing environment when conception occurs and there's an actual embryo to grow there in the uterus. While this lining is regrowing, hormones in the body are also signaling the ovaries to begin maturing one of the eggs that are contained there. All of the eggs are already in the ovaries, so they're not making the eggs, just releasing them from one month to the next. Individual eggs have to mature in the ovary before they can be released. This is going to take a few days as the endometrium is rebuilding itself, thickening in the uterus, and the egg is maturing in the ovary, but sometime in the midpoint of the cycle. And so we usually identify this as day 14, although, as I said before, because the length of the cycle is not always predictable and it's not the same for everyone, it can be affected by medicine that you're taking or your stress level or several different factors. It may not be exactly 14 days after menstruation. Somewhere around day 14, ovulation is going to occur. And ovulation means that the egg that has matured is released from the ovary, and at this point it's going to start traveling down the fallopian tube toward the uterus. Again, we can't be exactly sure about predicting what day this is going to happen. Could be a few days sooner, could be several days later, but somewhere in the midpoint of the cycle, the egg will be released, and this is ovulation. About a week after the egg has been released from the ovary, one of two things will happen. And which of these outcomes is going to happen depends entirely on whether or not that egg has been fertilized during the time that it was traveling through the fallopian tube. An egg is only viable for fertilization for about a day after it's been ovulated. So once it leaves the ovary, it needs to be fertilized relatively soon, or it's not going to have the potential to become a baby. If within the first day after ovulation occurs, sperm were to be present in the fallopian tube and fertilize the egg, this is what we call conception, meaning actual fertilization has occurred. And so the egg is still in the tube and it's continuing to travel to the uterus, but we now have a new human cell because the egg has been fertilized. It takes about a week for this to make it from the ovary to the uterus. And so about a week after ovulation, once that new cell, and by now it's more than one cell, reaches the uterus, if it implants in the wall of the uterus, pregnancy has officially occurred. Menstruation does not continue during pregnancy because the entire purpose of the menstrual cycle is to play a role in allowing pregnancy to occur. So if you're pregnant, there's no need to menstruate. In fact, you need that lining of the uterus to stay where it is and continue to be there for the nurturing of the baby. Everything that's going on in the reproductive system is going to shift from menstruation toward pregnancy and developing that new human life. However, if the egg was not fertilized, it continues its journey down the tube. Once it reaches the uterus, it's just a cell. It's no longer a viable egg. And at this point, the hormone levels in the body that were changing in anticipation of a potential pregnancy go back to normal, and the endometrium begins to loosen and detach from the walls of the uterus because it's not needed. There's no baby. There's no pregnancy that has occurred. And this is going to lead into the next menstrual cycle when the whole process starts all over again as the endometrium begins to be shed from the uterus. There are contractions of the muscles in the uterine wall that take place to help to loosen the lining and expel it from the body. These are very, very mild versions of the kind of contractions of the uterus that take place during childbirth. So labor pains are an extreme variety of the same types of cramps that are sometimes experienced around menstruation. Let's look a little more closely at what would happen if the egg had been fertilized. And so this diagram is meant to represent the stages of conception. And so at the bottom, the yellow structure that you see is representing the ovary, and you can see it's indicating a chamber of the ovary where there's an egg maturing, and that egg gets larger, there's fluid around it, and eventually the space that it's contained within, which is called a follicle, ruptures, bursts, and the egg is released from the ovary in that way. And so this is ovulation. The egg is released. And that's the first step of conception, because obviously in order to create a baby, you need two human cells, an egg cell and a sperm cell. And without both of those components, conception can't occur. This contribution, the egg half, is present when ovulation occurs. So the egg's going to leave the ovary and travel into the fallopian tube. A lot of people assume that everything to do with pregnancy happens in the uterus, meaning the egg is fertilized in the uterus, and that's where the cells begin to develop and where all of the growth takes place. In fact, a lot of the very beginning steps of the development of a new human take place in the fallopian tube on the way to the uterus and not actually in the uterus itself. Within 24 hours, while the egg is still viable, if there are sperm present in the fallopian tubes, the egg may be fertilized. As soon as the egg's fertilized, and we're not dealing anymore with an egg and a sperm and two separate sets of genetic information from two individual parents, we're no longer calling this an egg. It's now referred to as a blastocyst. It's a new human cell with a new combination of DNA and genetic traits it's no longer the information from just the egg or just the sperm. It's a combination of the two. And so as soon as the blastocyst is created, this new human cell, it's going to start copying itself and multiplying and making more and more cells. In the next 3 steps of the diagram, you can see that the cell has copied itself and become 2 and become 4 and become 8, and they're going to just continue to copy themselves and double. And as soon as there's more than one cell and the cells are replicating, multiplying, increasing, we can now refer to this as a zygote. Just for a moment, I'm going to take a sidestep and talk about how twins are conceived. And there are 2 different types of twins that we see, or really any multiple pregnancies with more than one baby that's born at the same time. One type are identical, and identical means that they have exactly the same genetic information, exactly the same DNA. In this case, we had an egg that became fertilized, so we had a new blastocyst, and in the very first division of that cell, when it was splitting into 2 copies of itself, if instead of staying inside the same membrane and becoming 2 copies of a cell as part of a new zygote, if instead those copies completely split from one another and became 2 separate blastocysts, both of those blastocysts would have the same genetic information because they're copies of the same original cell. Both of those 2 separate cells could continue to double and increase in number of cells inside the membrane, and we would now have 2 separate zygotes, both continuing to grow and develop. They would have the potential to become identical twins if both of those implant in the uterus and grow into fetuses and are able to successfully develop through the full term of a pregnancy. So that's how identical twins would happen. They are formed from the same original egg cell that was fertilized by one original sperm. It's just that when they originally divided into 2, instead of becoming copies of one cell inside one membrane, they split into 2 completely separate membranes, each to then develop into its own individual baby. The other type of twins that we see are what we call fraternal twins. Fraternal twins are different in that they came from 2 completely separate eggs that were fertilized by 2 completely different sperm. It just happened during the same menstrual cycle, the same ovulation time frame. Those 2 individual blastocysts developed into 2 separate zygotes, and both of them implanted and grew during the same gestational period, the same pregnancy. They're still considered twins, and they may even look incredibly similar and be assumed to be identical. The only way to determine if they're truly identical twins is by having them genetically tested to see if they have identical DNA. Otherwise, they are siblings who share all the same common traits that any other siblings might share. The difference is they were born at the same time. Fraternal twins can happen when a mother is either predisposed to release more than one egg every month when she ovulates, or taking some kind of medication, particularly fertility drugs, that are increasing the number of eggs released each cycle intentionally, one egg from each ovary or multiple eggs from the same ovary. All of those eggs have equal potential to be fertilized by separate individual sperm. Back to our example here, we have our zygote, our cluster of cells that is rapidly increasing in number as it continues to travel to the uterus. Eventually, it will reach the uterus and it will attach itself to the endometrial lining, that blood-rich tissue that we talked about, which is what is shed during menstruation. Once the zygote has implanted itself into the endometrium, it actually burrows into the endometrium, and that bundle of cells from the zygote, all those identical cells, they're actually going to divide themselves, and some of them will continue to grow and develop into the embryo, and the cells will specialize themselves into different types of cells. Some will become heart, and some will become brain and spinal cord, and some will become bones and other organs. But some of those cells won't become part of the baby at all. They will grow and develop separately into the placenta. And so the placenta is actually made from the same cells that the baby is made from. As soon as the zygote has implanted and some of those cells specialize themselves and begin to grow and develop into what will be the baby, this is now known as an embryo, and it will be considered an embryo for the first 8 weeks of development. After that, it will be considered a fetus. Hopefully, talking about the menstrual cycle and how ovulation and conception occur help you understand a little bit about what starts the whole process off and how the reproductive system functions to make that happen and what exactly is going on during menstruation and why.